Arachne. This is a myth as retold by Olivia E. Coolidge. Arachne was a maiden who became famous throughout Greece, though she was neither well born nor beautiful and came from no great city. So, if Arachne was not well born, that means that she wasn't born into a high place in society or that she wasn't born with a lot of wealth or riches. She lived in an obscure little village, so a little known village, and her father was a humble dyer of wool. So he was humble, meaning he was modest, not someone to brag about his skill or talent. In this way, he was very skillful, producing many varied shades, while above all, he was famous for the clear, bright scarlet, so a really brilliant shade of red, which is made from shellfish, and which was the most glorious of all the colors used in ancient Greece. Even more skillful than her father was Arachne. It was her task to spin the fleecy wool into a fine, soft thread and to weave it into cloth on the high standing loom within the cottage. So, a loom is literally the device or apparatus that is used to spin yarn or thread into the fabric. Arachne was small and pale from much working. Her eyes were light and her hair was a dusty brown. Yet she was quick and graceful, and her fingers, roughened as they were, went so fast that it was hard to follow their flickering movements. So soft and even was her thread, so fine her cloth, so gorgeous her embroidery, that soon her products were known all over Greece. No one had ever seen the like of them before. So we can infer that Arachne is extremely skilled and talented as somebody who spins yarn and thread into fabric. At last, Arachne's fame became so great that people used to come from far and wide to watch her working. Even the graceful nymphs would steal in from stream or forest. So, a nymph is a mythological spirit of nature. So, they would steal in and peep shyly through the dark doorway, watching in wonder the white arms of Arachne as she stood at the loom and threw the shuttle from hand to hand between the hanging threads, or drew out the long wool, fine as hair, from the distaff as she sat spinning. So the shuttle is a part of the loom that shoots the thread from one side to the other. And as it's doing it, it kind of makes a web, if you can picture that. And then a distaff is another part of the loom. It's the stick where that holds the wool. The wool is wound around it that makes it easy for spinning. Surely Athene herself must have taught her, people would murmur to one another. Who else could know the secret of such marvelous skill? Arachne was used to being wondered at, and she was immensely proud of the skill that had brought so many to look on her. Praise was all she lived for, and it displeased her greatly that people should think anyone, even a goddess, could teach her anything. So if we back up, when the people were saying Athene must have taught her, I wasn't quite sure who Athene was. But then when Arachne said that how could anybody think that even a goddess could teach her something? So Athene must be the goddess. Another little phrase that stands out to me is praise was all she lived for, which is really the opposite of her father, who was very humble and modest. Athene needed and wanted people to tell her how good she was at her skill. Therefore, when she heard them murmur, she would stop her work and turn round indignantly, that means angrily, to say, with my own 10 fingers I gained this skill, and by hard practice from early morning till night. I never had time to stand looking as you people do while another maiden worked, nor if I had, would I give Athene credit because the girl was more skillful than I. As for Athene's weaving, how could there be finer cloth or more beautiful embroidery than mine? If Athene herself were to come down and compete with me, she could do no better than I. So she's saying that not even a goddess is more talented or skillful than she is. One day, when Arachne turned round with such words, an old woman answered her, a gray old woman, bent and very poor, who stood leaning on a staff and peering at Arachne amid the crowd of onlookers. "Reckless girls," she said, "how dare you claim to be equal to the immortal gods themselves? I am an old woman and have seen much. Take my advice and ask pardon of Athene for your words. So ask Athene for forgiveness for what you said. Rest content with your fame of being the best spinner and weaver that mortal eyes have ever beheld." So this wording, rest content with your fame, not content. I meant to say content. Rest content with your fame. Well, if you are content, then you are satisfied, happy with something, and if you're resting, you are staying put or about something. So rest content with your fame. With being the best spinner and weaver with among mortals means just be happy with who you are and your skill. "Stupid old woman," said Arachne indignantly, "who gave you the right to speak in this way to me? It is easy to see that you were never good for anything in your day, or you would not come here in poverty and rags to gaze at my skill. If Athene resents my words, let her answer them herself. I have challenged her to a contest, but she, of course, will not come. It is easy for the gods to avoid matching their skill with that of men." So she's saying that Athene would not come because a goddess or a god would not want to be outdone by a mortal. At these words, the old woman threw down her staff and stood erect. That means tall. The wondering onlookers saw her grow tall and fair and stand dressed in long robes of dazzling white. They were terribly afraid as they realized that they stood in the presence of Athene. Arachne herself flushed red for a moment, for she had never really believed that the goddess would hear her. Before the group that was gathered there, she would not give in, so pressing her pale lips together in obstinacy, in stubbornness, and pride, she led the gods to one of the great looms and set herself before the other. Without a word, both began to thread the long woolen strands that hang from the rollers and between which the shuttles move back and forth. Many skeins lay heaped beside them to use, so many pieces of yarn and thread lay beside them, bleached white and gold and scarlet and other shades, varied as the rainbow. So they had not only a lot of yarn and thread, but in all sorts of beautiful colors. Arachne had never thought of giving credit for her success to her father's skill in dyeing, though in actual truth the colors were as remarkable as the cloth itself. So that's really interesting that Arachne needs so much praise, but yet she never would think of giving praise to her father, who is also very talented. Soon there was no sound in the room but the breathing of the onlookers, the whirring of the shuttles, and the creaking of the wooden frames as each pressed the thread up into place or tightened the pegs by which the whole was held straight. The excited crowd in the doorway began to see that the skill of both, in truth, was very nearly equal, but that, however the cloth might turn out, the goddess was the quicker of the two. A pattern of many pictures was growing on her loom. There was a border of twined branches of the olive, Athene's favorite tree, while in the middle, figures began to appear. As they looked at the glowing colors, the spectators realized that Athene was weaving into her pattern a last warning to Arachne. The central figure was the goddess herself, competing with Poseidon, the god of the sea, for the possession of the city of Athens. But in the four corners were mortals who had tried to strive, that means compete, with gods, and pictures of the awful fate that had overtaken them. The goddess ended a little before Arachne and stood back from her marvelous work to see what the maiden was doing. Never before had Arachne been matched against anyone whose skill was equal or even nearly equal to her own. As she stole glances from time to time at Athene and saw the goddess working swiftly, calmly, and always a little faster than herself, she became angry instead of frightened, and an evil thought came into her head. Thus, as Athene stepped back a pace to watch Arachne finishing her work, she saw that the maiden had taken for her design a pattern of scenes which showed evil or unworthy actions of the gods, how they had deceived fair maidens, resorted to trickery, and appeared on earth from time to time in the form of poor and humble people. When the goddess saw this insult glowing in bright colors on Arachne's loom, she did not wait while the cloth was judged, but stepped forward, her gray eyes blazing with anger, and tore Arachne's work across. So she basically destroyed Arachne's work. Then she struck Arachne across the face. Arachne stood there a moment, struggling with anger, fear, and pride. "I will not live under this insult," she cried, and seizing a rope from the wall, she made a noose that would have hanged herself. The goddess touched the ropes and touched the maiden. "Live on, wicked girl," she said. "Live on and spin, both you and your descendants. When men look at you, they may remember that it is not wise to strive to compete with Athene." At that, the body of Arachne shriveled up, and her legs grew tiny, spindly, and distorted. There, before the eyes of the spectators, hung a little dusty brown spider on a slender thread. All spiders descend from Arachne, and as the Greeks watched them spinning their thread wonderfully fine, they remembered the contest with Athene and thought it was not right for even the best of men to claim equality with the gods.